Hello, advanced social psychology students. So welcome to this module 4 of Unit 1. We're going to be discussing Chapter 3, the self. So let me get to the PowerPoint presentation. Here we go. There we are. Okay. So this lecture video is only about 45 minutes long, or I hope it will be only about 45 minutes long. It's a little bit shorter than some of the other chapters. And of course, we need to start by defining what do we mean by the self in the first place, and how do we measure it? Because one of the best ways for us to clarify what we mean by a concept is to operationally define it, which means to define something based on how you measure it. And once you know how we measure the self, it helps give you a better idea of what we're talking about with the self. And then we're going to talk about some theories of the self, some ways that people's selves differ, and then we're going to talk about several theories of the self. Okay, well, let's begin. So the definition. So what is the self? It's our sense of personal identity of who we are as individuals. So who do you think I am? Or who do I think I am? That's my self. In many ways, like we were just talking in the last lecture series about schemas, well, we have a schema for who it is we are. So I have a schema for being Mary Dzindalette. That schema is my self-concept or myself. Okay. How do we go about measuring someone's self-concept? The most popular measure by far is called the TST, and it stands for 20 Statements Test. And you give someone a sheet of paper on the computer, the questions come up one at a time, and it says, I am blank line. And you ask the person to fill in the blank line. I know it sounds really boring, but it is amazing how, like, what a good test this is. It's one of the best ways we have to measure it. So what I'd like you to do now is take out a piece of paper, write, I am blank 20 times, stop this video and fill it in. Fill it in. I'd like you to take the TST, okay? So stop the video and come back after you've taken it. Okay, welcome back. I hope you took this opportunity to actually do the TST. Now, when we do the research and look at what are the kinds of information that people have in their TSTs, what's the kind of information that's in people's self schemas or self concepts? And there tends to be about 3 different kinds of information. First is there'll be some physical characteristics. You're tall, you're short, you're a male, you're a female, you've got short hair, long hair, you're athletic, your age, all different kinds of physical characteristics. Another thing that tends to be in our self-concepts are our personality traits. So in psychology, I'm sure you already know, if you've had advanced psychology of personality, you definitely know, but the big 5. So the neuroticism, the openness to new experiences, the introversion or extroversion, the conscientiousness, and agreeableness. So people are going to put their personality traits down. So now it may not be that obviously they're not going to put all of them down, but they're going to put down some personality traits that they have. And then the last, and oftentimes the one that there's more of these than any of the others, they're going to put down groups that they belong to, groups that they identify with. And that is like the kinds of things that people put down to the I am blank. Now, you might ask, or I asked, I guess I should say, okay, for each of these, there's a million things I could talk about. So I'll just do myself. For my physical characteristics, I'm a woman in my 60s. I've got gray hair. I'm 5'6". I'm a little overweight, maybe a little bit more than a little. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. I could talk about a whole bunch of different physical characteristics. My personality traits, same thing. The groups I belong to, same thing. So what ends up being in the top 20 things I'm going to talk about? And what the research shows, especially for the physical characteristics and the personality traits, you tend to put down the things that made you unique in your family of origin. So, for example, I'm the oldest of 6 kids. I grew up in a suburb of Boston. We always joke that my mom was a Kennedy wannabe. So we had a whole bunch of kids, and 5 girls, 1 boy. So in my house, with the 8 of us, if you include my parents, being a girl was absolutely ordinary and common. Of the 8 of us living in the house, 6 of us were female. So when I do the I am test, rarely do I have I'm a woman or I'm female on there, because I, on some level, grew up with being female, being a woman was just the most ordinary thing in the world. It wasn't something to like cling your identity to. But my brother, on the other hand, being one of only 2 males in the entire house, it's very likely that if we did the TST test with him, he'd have on there, I am a man, okay, or I'm male, or I was a boy, or something. Okay, same with personality traits. Now, personality traits tend to be very heritable, right? So if you're introverted, most likely one or both of your parents are introverted also. But if you have a personality trait that made you different from the people that you grew up with, it's likely that that will be in the I am blank line test too. That will show up. So our self-concept tends to include physical characteristics and personality traits that made us unique when we were growing up in the family of origin, and that we still hold today. And then also the groups that we belong to and identities that we have based on the social groups that we belong to. Okay, so that is our self-concept. That is our self-schema. Now, once we have our self-concept or our self-esteem, and we're always, it's always changing a little bit and developing as we grow. But once we have it, everything that we talked about in the last chapter last week about schemas relates to your self-concept, because it's just a schema about yourself. So we process information that's about the schema, about yourself, more quickly than information that is not relevant to your self-schema. We also process information that's consistent with our self-schemas more quickly. We pay more attention to it, and we better remember it than information that's inconsistent with our self-schemas. And we better remember information that's processed in relationship to ourself. If you go back to the very first week that we were together and we read that article about SQ4R, the self-referencing effect, if we can say, and that's why in these article summaries, I'm having you go, how does this relate to your life? Because if you can make the information relate to you, you'll better remember it. So again, the self-concept ends, or our self-schemas end up becoming really important to us. It affects how we process information. It affects how we remember information. Now, there are some ways in which our concepts of ourself, our self-schema, our self-concepts differ. And the 2 of them are complexity and clarity. Okay. And self-complexity is exactly what you think it's going to be. It's how many different and relatively independent ways you have of thinking about yourself. So, like if someone said, who is Mary? I could say, well, there's Mary, who's the retired professor. There's Mary, who's the wife of George Porter. There's Mary, who's the mom of kids with ADHD. There's Mary, who's looking forward to grandkids. There's Mary, who's lucky enough to have parents who are still alive. There's Mary, who's a member of the Catholic Church. Like I've got all of these different parts of me that make up my self-esteem, or I'm sorry, my self-concept or my self-schema. And what the research shows is that the more complex your identity is, your self-concept, your self-schema is, usually the higher your self-esteem, the lower levels of stress and illness you have, and the greater tolerance you have for frustration. And to help make this clear, let's think about a hypothetical person. I'll just call her Nancy. Hopefully none of you have the name Nancy. And Nancy's an ice skater. And I'm picking ice skating because I'm thinking there's probably no ice skaters who are taking this course in Oklahoma. So hopefully that's right. If you're an ice skater, please don't take this personally. I'm making these videos before I even have a course roster and know who's going to be taking the course. Okay. But I meet Nancy and I talk to her, and I'm like, tell me about yourself. And Nancy tells me all about her skating history, how long she skated, how much she loves skating, her passion for skating, how her bedspread has ice skaters on it, the walls in her room are all decorated with ice skaters. I ask her, who's one of the people that you most admire? And she says Peggy Fleming, because she was such a great ice skater, and so on and so on. And I keep talking with Nancy. In a very short period of time, will probably ascertain that she's got very low self-complexity. She's got one version of herself, ice skater Nancy, and that's all there is. Does that make sense? Now, Nancy is likely to have lower self-esteem and higher levels of stress and illness, and have a higher time tolerating frustration. And it may be because anytime her ability to ice skate is threatened in any way, like that's it. That's all she has. Does that kind of make sense? Where like one of my kids, oh gosh, more than both of my kids at one point, I'm sure when they were younger, screamed, "I hate you. You're a terrible mom." And at the moment, I probably was like, yeah, I don't like you so much either right now either. But probably if that happened, even if I agreed with them and said I'm not a very good mom, I'm like, yeah, well, I'm a good teacher, or yeah, but I'm good at this, I'm a good wife, or something like that. And of course, it's natural for your kids to scream and yell like that. And it doesn't even mean that they think it. And at the time, I don't even know that I believe what they said. But you get the sense of what I'm talking about. That if you take a hit to one version of yourself, you've got these other versions that you can kind of bring in. And so the more complex your sense of self is, or the more complex your self schema or your self concept is, it really helps you to be more resilient. It gives you greater tolerance for frustration, lower levels of stress and illness, and higher self-esteem. Okay, another way in which our self-concepts can vary has to do with clarity. And this, again, is very self-explanatory. It's, do you have a really defined, clear sense of your self-schema? Does that kind of make sense? And is it consistent? So that TST test, if I am blank, I am blank, I am blank. If I give it to you, like you just took it today, if I had you take it a month from now, are you going to give me pretty much the same 20 things? Are there some things about yourself that you're really not sure how you are? And it's not like you're clear that you're in the middle. I'm not super extroverted, I'm not super introverted, I'm smack in the middle. Well, then I'm still clear about what my self concept is, but you're not even clear about it. You're like, sometimes I'm really outgoing and sometimes I'm really introverted, and I have no idea when I'm going to be those things. I'm not sure what I am. That would be low self-concept clarity. And the research is clear that the more clear your self-concept is, the higher your self-esteem. And this may be like adolescence is a really a time for great change and lots to deal with. And oftentimes, during that time with the bodies changing and hitting puberty and emotional regulation being a little bit more difficult and friends playing a bigger role in your life than family, um, all of that together really leaves many people during that stage of life with a much less clear self-concept, because you're sort of shedding the self-concept that your family gave you and you're creating this new one with these people, friends and sports and all these other kinds of things, and everything's changing. And during that time, self-esteem for a lot of people take some self-esteem hits. So complexity and clarity are two characteristics of our self-esteem, or not self-esteem, our self-concept or self-schema that vary. Okay, now I want to talk about self-awareness. And self-awareness is different than self-clarity. So although you might call it its sister or something, self-awareness is how aware are you of who it is that you are. And so if you have a really clear self-concept, then probably you are self-aware also, but you could see situations where they're not related. So the more self-aware people are, chances are the more accurate they are, or the research shows, the more accurate they are at predicting their behavior in a whole bunch of different situations, the happier they are and the more resilient they are. So having someone who's high in self-awareness is really important. If you have low self-awareness, that's something you want to work on. And if you really think yours is low, therapy is great at making someone become more aware. Now, there's a theory that was created by Wicklund that is his theory of objective self-awareness. It's different than just regular self-awareness. And objective self-awareness is when you are looking at yourself as though you're an object. You're looking at yourself the way other people might see you. And so that's less as an object, but you're still a person, but you're looking at yourself more objectively. You're trying to see you the way other people might see you. Does that kind of make sense? And Wicklund, his theory says that when we become objectively self-aware, and before I even say what happens, how can I induce someone to become self-aware? Have them look at themselves in the mirror, right? If I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I'm looking at myself the way other people look at me. I watch myself in a videotape, listen to your tape recording of your voice. All these things will make you objectively self-aware. And what Wicklund hypothesized is that when we become objectively self-aware, three things come to mind. Our actual self, because we're sitting there watching it, right? Our ideal self. So our ideal self is who it is we want to be. So our actual self and our ideal self. And for most of us, there's a big difference between the two. And that difference between the two can be disappointing, disconcerting, and a little depressing. And in fact, there was research done by Giacomelli and Figurski a long time ago, back in the 1970s. It's really, maybe it was the early 80s, but old study. But what they did is they wanted to know how often people thought about themselves. And at the time, the idea was that people think about themselves all the time. They're very self-centered, and this is how life is. So they asked people to carry on a beeper. That's how long ago it was, right? And on these beepers, it would randomly beep them 8 times a day for like 2 weeks, but never like after midnight and before 6 in the morning or something. So like during bed, you weren't bothered. But when you were beeped randomly during the day, you were supposed to take out these index cards and indicate what you were doing, how you were feeling, and like it was a mood questionnaire, and what you were doing at the time, and what you were thinking about, right? So what am I thinking about? What am I doing right now? And then a mood inventory. And they tried to get a really representative sample. So the people varied greatly from 18 to 65, all different age groups, all different occupations, all different socioeconomic statuses, all different sexes, different races, different. They wanted to get a really representative sample of the population of, I think they did this study in the United States, so it was of people in America. And what they found blew them away. First of all, people did not think about themselves very much. It was only the 6th most common thing that people were thinking about. The number 1 thing was work. Number 2 was no thoughts at all. Number 3 was family, and then it went on from there. I always think there's something these people were a little different because food would have been in my top 3, and food was way down like number 10 or something. So I don't know if I have disordered eating or if the people in the study didn't or something. I don't know. But in addition to finding out that people actually don't think about themselves very much, the other thing that they learned is when people were thinking about themselves, they were less likely to be moving around. In other words, when they were asked what they were doing, they tended to be sedentary or not doing anything. And secondly, they were much more depressed and sad than when they were thinking about other things. And they chose Wicklund's theory of objective self-awareness to try to explain this. They said when people are thinking of themselves in this objective way, the difference between their actual self and ideal self becomes really prominent, and they become a little, bummer. I've got a long way to go to be the person I want to be. Okay. Another thing that I want to talk about is self-esteem. And I know earlier in this lecture, I don't know exactly how many minutes we're into it right now, but earlier I've said esteem, and this is the first time I'm actually talking about self-esteem. Before it was always self-concept and self-schema, and I kept using the word self-esteem incorrectly, right? So self-concept, self-schema is basically the same thing. It's who it is that we think we are. And we've talked about how it can vary in complexity, it can vary in clarity, and people can vary in how aware they are of who it is that they are. And that the more aware you are of yourself, the more clear it is and the more complex it is, there's certain advantages, especially for self-esteem and resiliency. I want to now talk about self-esteem. So self-esteem is the positive or negative feelings that we have about ourselves. So where self-concept or self-schema is who it is that you think you are, self-esteem is how happy you are with the who that you think you are. Okay. And I have an example for this that I think brings this point home very well. And it happened probably 20 years ago. So my husband, we go to his church often, and we got to, for decades, and we got to watch this child become a teenager, become a young woman. And her name is Lauren Nelson. And I didn't normally watch the Miss America pageant, but all of a sudden, Lauren Nelson from Lawton, Oklahoma, was in the Miss America pageant. And so, like, we had a big pageant night party with food and tons of people. And we were sitting there, watching the pageant. And at one point in the TV show, it wasn't the formal interview, but they were doing like informal discussions with each of the people who had made it to, I think, the top 10 or something. And they asked Lauren, what do you think is going to be an obstacle for you in winning the title? And she said her height. She said, I'm 5'7". Maybe she said 5'8". And if I win, which she ended up winning, but she said, if I win, I will be the shortest Miss America winner in the history of the award, of the honor. And I remember being blown away because at the time I was the same height as she was. But for her, this height was something, so our self-concept, our self schema included, we're both 5'7" or 5'8", I forget what it was, okay? But for her, it was the stumbling block that could potentially keep her from getting her dream of becoming Miss America. It obviously had hurt her from some modeling experiences and such like this. Where for me, I loved being 5'8". That's why I'm not sure if it's 5'7" or 5'8", because I've shrunk and now I'm 5'6.5". So I don't know what I started out as. I can't remember. But I remember loving being that height. I could wear clothes off, could buy clothes and wear them off the rack. I didn't have to have stuff hemmed or brought out. It was a lot less expensive. Never any of my dreams of, getting a master's in applied statistics, a PhD in experimental psychology. My height never kept me from anything with either of those. No one cared what my height was. So for me, here, Lauren Nelson and I have the same self-concept of being 5'8", but her self-esteem over being 5'8" was negative. It was getting in her way. And for me, it was like a huge advantage. So self-esteem is how you feel, how happy or sad you are about who it is that you are. Okay. Now, remember, this example that I used with Lauren Nelson isn't like your whole self-concept. It was just one little piece, but I think it illustrates it pretty well. Okay. How do we measure self-esteem? We've talked about how we measure self-concept and self-schema. It's that I am blank 20 times. The most popular inventory or scale that measures self-esteem is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. So I want you to stop the video right now. I want you to go to the textbook, which is free, to section 3.2 of this chapter, chapter 3 on the self, and I want you to take the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. And if you don't want to take it, I mean, you don't have to let me know whether you took it or not, but if you don't want to take it, give it to your kid or to a friend, your mom, your husband, your wife. Give it to someone or take it yourself so that you really have a good idea of what the scale is. Because again, when you graduate from this program, you're going to have a Master's of Science of Behavioral Sciences General Psychology track. People are going to expect that you know what the Rosenberg self-esteem scale is. So I want you to stop the video, take the scale, and then come back. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully you didn't have any issues taking it. It might have surprised you, some of the questions that were on there. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you were like, yep, that's what I thought would be on a self-esteem scale. I'm sure you could see how the scale measured how happy you are or negative you are about who it is that you are most of the time. And for that reason, we say that it measures your trait self-esteem. So you remember, a trait is something that you have that lasts, it's who you are most of the time. So your trait of extroversion or introversion, or in the middle of both of them, the middle of that scale, that's who you probably were as a kid, a teenager, a young adult, the age that you are now, and you'll still probably be that way when you're in the nursing home. They don't change that much. So there's a trait aspect to our self-esteem where it doesn't change that much. Now, it can some, like if you set out to increase your self-esteem and you go into therapy and you learn more about, then it can change. Just like if you set out to make yourself more extroverted and you do, Dale Carnegie's How to Do Good Speeches, and you're like, I'm setting out to do this, you can then act more extroverted, right? So, but with traits, most of the time, we tend to stay this way over our entire lifespan. There are also scales, but there's a whole bunch of different ones that measure state self-esteem. State self-esteem is, how are you feeling about yourself right now? Does that kind of make sense? So most of the research that looks at state self-esteem, what they do is they do something like they'll have you walk by papers that they make it where all the papers fall off the desk right as you walk by. You think you were a klutz and knock them over, but in reality, they had it set up so they'd press a button and they'd all fall, but you don't know that. And then they'll measure your self-esteem. And lots of times people's self-esteem will take a little dip after they did something really klutzy. Or they'll give you feedback that no one in the room wanted to work with you, and then measure your state self-esteem. And you'll take a hit. Rejection will lower people's self-esteem, not their trait self-esteem. That stays pretty constant. But at that moment, how positively or negatively do you feel about who it is that you are? So your state self-esteem is, how do you feel about yourself right now at this second? Not globally, overall, most of the time, but right now in this moment after what just happened. Does that kind of make sense? So we've got our trait self-esteem, our state self-esteem. We also have a thing called our self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is how good you think you are at a very specific thing. So self-esteem is like overall, how happy or sad you are with who it is that you are most of the time in like overall. But self-efficacy is going to be very specific. So it's going to be like, how happy or how positive or negative are you about your self-esteem as a writer? Or not self-esteem, your self-concept as a writer. So your self-efficacy could be how good it is that you think you are as a baseball player, how good it is that you think you are as a mom, how good it is that you think you are as a cook, how good it is that you think you are as a baker, how good it is that you think you are at taking multiple choice exams. So we're going to have self-efficacy in all these different areas. Does that kind of make sense? So self-efficacy is how good you are at a very specific thing. Self-esteem is global, but it could be global at this particular moment in time. That's your state self-esteem, or global across all different times and spaces. That's going to be your trait self-esteem. Now, you might be going, who cares about self-efficacy, Mary? Why are you even telling us about it? Self-efficacy really affects things a lot. In fact, it will affect how much you're going to challenge yourself. So let me tell you about an experiment that I think will bring home how this is so important or why it's so important. So what they did is they took children, I think they were about 10 years old, but I may have that a little bit wrong. And they gave them a ring toss thing where there would be a stick in the ground. And then they had these rings and they had them stand behind this line and then to throw the ring on the stick. And the idea was to get as many rings as you could to go over around the stick. And what they set it up based on how close or far away it was, so that the kid would do really well at it or not so well at all. Then, regardless of even if they did do well, they told them like maybe they missed one. They told them how they did really well. So even if they had missed several, they were told that they got more than 100 other kids of their same age that just came through the line. Or they were told that they were one of the worst. And they made it so they were further away. They missed more of them in the first place, but they were even told that of the last 100 kids that went through here, all of them did better than you. So they made the kid feel as though they made the kid either have high or low self-efficacy in this ring toss game. Then they brought them back a couple days later. It might have been a week later, it might have been a day later, but they brought them back. And they said, we are going to give you the opportunity to play the ring toss again. And you're going to spend the next half hour, here it is, or here are the rings. Where would you like us to put the stick? And the child got to choose how far from the starting line that stick should go. Does that kind of make sense? And what they found was the kids with low self-esteem put the stick really close. So they would get almost every single one. They made it so that they made the task really easy for them to succeed. Where the kids with high self-esteem for this task, not self-esteem, I'm sorry, high self-efficacy for this ring toss task, they tended to make the stake much further away. And because they were challenging themselves, it was further away. They missed a lot more of them, but they got better. So that's the trick with self-efficacy. If you are low in self-efficacy, you tend to avoid the task altogether. But if we make you do it, you set it up where you don't challenge yourself very much. So you limit your ability to really improve. Whereas people with high self-efficacy will challenge themselves. And when you challenge yourself, you do get better. So self-efficacy becomes really, really important in improving. So when I'm talking to a student, a freshman in a Gen Psych class, and they say they're not a very good reader, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they're starting college with low self-efficacy about reading. Reading is fundamental in college, especially if you're a psychology major. So what are we going to do about this? And if they can't get some wins and increase their self-efficacy about reading, I'm going to have a hard time getting them to read. And what they read is going to be simple stuff where they're not going to really be developing their vocabulary. If I can, however, increase their self-efficacy in reading, then they're more likely to read. And of course, how do you become a good reader? By reading more. And what do you want to be reading? Texts that are a little bit struggle, where you have to struggle a little, where there's a few words that you don't know, where the vocabulary is a little bit harder, so that you're getting better and better. So you can see the important role that self-efficacy plays in actual performance in the end, which then affects your self-esteem, because then that's like one area, if you, and self-esteem is putting them all together. Okay. All right. So we've gone through self-awareness, self-esteem, self-efficacy. Now let's talk about the different theories of the self. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 4 of these are talked about in the book, and this is the last slide. So 4 of these are talked about in the book, but the first one, the personal social identity continuum, that one is not in the textbook. So I want to make sure I do a really good job really good job explaining this one to you. Okay, so the personal social identity continuum says that we have a whole bunch of different social identities. And so that's where social identity theory comes in. So I have a social identity of being a Cameron University professor. Even though I'm an adjunct faculty person now, I'm still an adjunct faculty professor, right? I also have a social identity about being someone who studies and loves psychology. I have a social identity about being a mom. I have a social identity about being a woman. I have a social identity about being in my 60s. I have a social identity about living in Lawton. I have a social identity of growing up in the Boston area. I have a social identity of my daughter being at Berkeley. So I'm a Berkeley mom. Like I've got all of these different social identities, correct? So personal social identity continuum says at any one moment in time, I can be on a continuum between seeing myself as a complete, unique individual, Mary Teresa Frances de Zindelet, different from any other human being on the planet, all the way to being a complete member of some social identity. I am a Cameron professor. I'm a member of the Cameron community. Okay. And where am I going to be on this continuum? Am I going to be seeing myself as Mary de Zindelet, seeing myself as Mary de Zindelet, who is a member of the Cameron community, or seeing myself as I'm Cameron, Cameron, Cameron and me, we're the same. Where am I on this continuum? And the research shows, or the theory suspects, that where you are in this continuum is based on what is salient around you. So right now, I'm sitting in a Cameron University office in Nance Boyer, which is where the psychology department is. So right now, on my personal social identity continuum, I'm going to be like, it's going to push me toward the Cameron community side because I'm sitting in a Cameron University building. That kind of makes sense? When I teach this class in person, sometimes there'll be someone in the class who will have on a Cameron sweatshirt. That sweatshirt leads everyone in the class to be more toward the Cameron community member part of our social identity continuum and less toward our personal, individual, unique self part of the continuum. Now, the interesting thing, though, is we have all these different social identities. Remember I told you that? So while I've got this continuum of Mary as a unique individual, Mary, a Cameron community member, there's also Mary as a unique individual, Mary as a mom. Mary is a unique individual. Mary is a woman in her 60s. Mary is a unique individual. Mary as a psychology person. Mary is a unique individual. Mary is a Lawtonian. Mary is a unique individual. Mary as someone who's been married to someone for over 30 years, and so on and so on and so on. It's almost like a bicycle, right? A wheel of a bicycle. There's all these stokes going all different ways. So which social identity continuum spoke am I even on? Again, salience. Because I'm talking right now about advanced social psychology, a social psychology topic, I'm probably going to be, and I'm talking at Cameron, I'm probably going to be pretty high on the I love psychology side and pretty high on the Cameron University side on these personal social identity two continuums. Does that kind of make sense? And all day long, all throughout the day, we go up and down through these spokes. Does that kind of make sense? So I look around, I'm in the Cameron building, there I go. I'm talking about psychology, here I am. Oh boy, I'm a woman, here I go. And you just go back and forth. And then oftentimes when you hit the pillow at night, you're back to, your head hits the pillow at night, you're back to, I'm a unique individual, different from anyone who's ever lived. I am Mary. I'm on that personal side of the personal social identity continuum rather than being on any of the continuums. Now, I say that, maybe you go to bed at night and your comforter is, I want to say Dallas Cowboys, so maybe you live in Dallas, I don't know. And there's Dallas Cowboy paraphernalia all around you, then you might go to sleep at night really heavy on the I am a Dallas fan, a Dallas Cowboy fan social identity continuum. So it really is based on what is salient around you, what you're thinking about, and the cues around your environment. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, the personal social identity continuum. If it doesn't, you can always email me with some questions, marydz@cameron.edu, because that is not in the textbook. Okay, now let's go to some other theories that are in the textbook that are really important. Social comparison theory. And I'm sure you, like me, your mother taught you you heard this quote growing up all the time. Nothing will rob you from happiness like comparing yourself to others. And you're told, like, don't compare yourself to others. Just compare yourself to an earlier version of you. I know I said that to my kids all the time. My mom said it to me all the time. You hear it from, all the people who try to make you feel better about yourself. They talk about, social comparison is will rob you of happiness and joy, that you don't want to do it. Although that might be true, research is really clear that we spend quite a bit of time in social comparison. And so I want to talk with you about two different kinds of social comparison, upward and downward, and they're exactly what you think they are. So upward social comparison is when you compare yourself to people who are better than you. Downward social comparison is, yes, when you compare yourself to people who are not as good as you, have it worse off. So better is upward, worse is downward, okay? And the research is clear that there are self-esteem advantages to both upward and downward social comparison. So in tasks, if you want to get better at something, you will do better if you do some upward social comparison with someone who's slightly better than you. So if you get back your midterm exam, I mean, not your midterm, your exam one, your unit one exam, and let's say you got a C, you're like, bummer, I thought I'd do better. If you find someone in the class who got a B and you go to study with them, you're doing upward social comparison. The person did better than you, but not a whole bunch better than you. That is going to probably make it where on the next exam you're going to do better. And because you're improving, your self-esteem will improve. You're like, woohoo, I figured this out. Okay. Now, if you decide to study with the person who got the highest grade in the class, who I tell everyone they got all the points right and even got some bonus points, so they ended with 105. You're probably, if you go to study with them, they just seem so much higher than you, you're going to feel lousy about yourself. You're not going to improve as much because you don't even understand what they're talking about. So upward social comparison with someone who's slightly better than you leads your performance to improve and increases your self-esteem. Okay. However, downward social comparison increases your self-esteem in every other way. Other than a performance thing, all the other time, downward social comparison is better. And I mean, like, I'm going to give you an example. Women who have breast cancer, okay? Research is clear that they live longer. We're not just talking they feel better and their self-esteem is increased. They're more likely to live if they compare themselves with people who have more serious forms of cancer, who have it worse off, than if they compare themselves with people who don't have cancer at all. So the woman who gets cancer, let's say breast cancer, because that's where the research was done. Woman who gets breast cancer, of course, you're going to have an initial period where you're going to grieve. Oh my gosh, this isn't what I was expecting. This is awful. That's completely normal. But then after a while, there are some women who do upward social comparison. Why me? Everyone else is totally healthy and I'm here with the breast cancer. They are more likely to die than the women who go, well, when I go in for my chemotherapy, I'm seeing people who've got leukemia and cancer that's hit their lymph nodes, much more severe, much more serious forms of cancer. I have breast cancer, which has a really high likelihood of going away if I follow the radiation and chemotherapy. And so you can see they're comparing themselves to people who are doing worse. And those women live longer. It's one reason why sometimes I wonder if this doesn't play a role in some group therapies. So, not necessarily group therapy, but groups that work. So, if you've got a group of people who all lost a child and they're helping support groups and they're helping one another, you might be like, oh my gosh, I lost my kid. It's awful. And it is. I mean, I can't think of anything worse. But you go to a support group of other people and you learn that there's a man there who all three kids were in a car and it was a car wreck and he was driving the car and all three kids died. And you're like, whoa, I might have it bad because I lost a kid, but he lost three kids and he was driving the car. Like, oh my word. See how that's downward social comparison. And the downward social comparison is really helpful for self-esteem, for more positive outlook on life, happiness, resilience, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, I've got a couple other little things I need to say. When it comes to social comparison, when we compare ourselves initially, not to make ourselves better because we're going to work with them, but we just learn about someone. When we learn about people who are better than we are, we're going to have a hit to our self-esteem, right? So if I pass back the Unit 1 exams and I let you know that 90% of the people got an A and 5% got a B, but you got a C, you're going to be like, bummer, everyone did better than me. So you're going to have a hit to your self-esteem, okay? And if I give you information that tells you you did better than most people, it's going to improve your self-esteem. So doing well increases, comparing ourselves to people who are doing worse increases our self-esteem. Comparing ourselves to people who do better than us decreases our self-esteem. But here's a caveat to that. If the person did really well in something that we don't care about, and we're really good friends with them, it can actually increase our self-esteem. What we call it is we bask in the glory of our friend. So when I went to college in upstate New York, I wanted to be able to sing better, even though I sang horribly. And so I took voice lessons, and I actually had a great time. That it was private lessons. The woman, my scholarship covered it, and the woman was very prim and proper with the cameo here. And at the beginning, she was like, "People always underestimate their voice potential." Then she heard me sing, and I think she kind of changed her mind. And so I sang with marbles in my mouth and in front of candles. I didn't breathe right. I didn't hear right. A lot of stuff wrong. But she really helped me get better. And every semester, at the end of the semester, she'd do a recital. I always got her most improved student. All these people were really, really good. And there was me, way, way at the bottom. But one of my very best friends was a great singer. And later on, she became so good that she was in the Philadelphia Philharmonic doing, I think, Gretel and Hansel and Gretel. That's how good she was. And when I'm just telling you and I'm talking into a little camera all alone in an office, just the thoughts of you guys hearing that, I don't even know who you guys are yet, thrills me a little bit because I have a close friend who is in the Philadelphia Philharmonic. Like, oh my goodness, like not Philharmonic, opera. And I'm just like so proud of that. Why? Because I knew for a long, long time, I'm not a good singer at all. I'm not going to be a good singer, and I'm okay with that. When I went to hug my voice teacher goodbye after my 4 years of undergrad, I told her how much I loved taking the classes and how I was going to keep doing it in graduate school, but in graduate school, the scholarship, you're not really on scholarship and it wouldn't cover it. And I was going to have to pay out of pocket. And as I hugged her, she said, Mary, save your money. She was like, I got you as good as you're going to get. It's not going to get any better. So I'm okay with not being a good singer. It's not part of my I am list, never says I'm a good singer. Does that make sense? So on something that you're fine not being good at, someone who's really good at it, and if you're good friends with them, instead of lowering your self-esteem, actually can increase it because you're sort of like basking in the glory of your friend. They're good at it. Somehow it makes me seem like I'm good at it too. Does that kind of make sense? So social comparison theory, it can get a little bit confusing. Upward social comparison with a stranger or a friend. can give you a hit to your self-esteem unless it's a friend and it's in an area that you don't really care about, and then it can actually increase your self-esteem. And performance-wise, it can increase your self-esteem if you have a stranger or a friend who's a little bit better, and then you work with them, and so you end up improving. So it's a little complicated, but I think you got it. Okay. All right, now let's move to a completely different theory that almost has nothing to do with social comparison theory, called self-perception theory. And this is going to become very important when we go to the chapter that looks at attitudes. So I want you to know this. It is very counterintuitive, or at least it was for me. When I first learned this, I was like, this is a bunch of malarkey. And I'm fine with you not agreeing with it, with you thinking it's ridiculous. That's fine. But it is important that you know it. So self-perception theory was put forth by Bem in the late 60s. And what Bem says is that we come to know our attitudes, emotions, opinions by watching our behavior. Just like I know another person's attitudes, emotions, and opinions by watching their behavior. Now, I don't know about you, but this seems very counterintuitive. I would say I know what my attitudes and emotions and opinions are, and that's what leads to my behavior. I'm not looking at my behavior to know what my attitude is. I'm not looking at my behavior to know what my emotion is. I'm not looking at my opinion to know what I'm not looking at my behavior to know what my opinion is. It's like my behavior comes from my attitudes, my emotions, and my opinions. I know them, and that's why I act the way that I act. That's how it feels to me. But self-perception theory says, I don't care what it feels like. This is what's really going on, that we don't have much access to our attitudes, emotions, and opinions, not as much as we think we do. And we look at our behavior to know what we're feeling and what we think about things. Okay. Now, obviously, there's some support for this theory, or I wouldn't be teaching it to you, but it may surprise you how applicable it is. So there's a therapy in which couples therapist, where a couple comes to you and the couple says, or one member, I'll just pick on the man. The man says, I used to love her, and I do think she's a great person, but I'm not in love with her anymore. I used to be in love with her, but I'm not in love with her anymore. And the therapist might say, what were some of the behaviors that you did when you were in love with her? And he might say, oh, I'd call her a couple times during the day just to see how she was. I would send her little text saying, thinking of you. I would buy her flowers like once a week. I would take her out to dinner so that we could, and dancing so we could have fun together once a month. I don't know. I'm just making those up. Okay. And what the therapist would say is, for the next month, I want you to do those behaviors. I want you to text her a couple of times and say, I'm thinking of you. I want you to call her throughout the day and go, guess what? Look what happened. I wanted to share it with you first. Look what's going on with me, sharing your life. I want you to send flowers once a week, and I want you to go on a date night where you go out to dinner and dancing. And according to self-perception theory, after a month of watching your behavior, it should change your attitudes, your opinions, your emotions. And sure enough, therapists will report that after doing this for a month or two, the husbands come back and they go, I don't know what it is, but all the feelings are back. I'm in love again. So there's some support for this, not just experimental support, but some therapists that have applied this and it's worked. Does that kind of make sense? Again, I don't need for you to agree with it. You might think it's a bunch of malarkey, and I'm okay with that, but you do need to know what it is. Okay. All right, let's move to the second to last theory. This is self-verification theory. This was created by Swan in the 1980s, and it's huge. People seek to confirm their self-concept, their self-schema. So if I think I'm an organized person, it's going to be really important to me that you think that I'm organized also. I need you to verify my perception of myself. I need you to verify my self-concept, my self-schema. Does that kind of make sense? And it's really important to people. Now, this ends up becoming a real problem or a dilemma for someone who's got low self-esteem, because I want you to verify that I'm not worthy of a lot, that I'm not that great of a person. But at the same time, I want you to think good of me because we all want everyone to think good of us. But I need you also to verify my version of how I see me. So you could see how it's really difficult for someone with low self-esteem to meet both of these needs. Does that make sense? So I think you will find it interesting if during the next week or two, you really pay attention to some of your interactions with people, especially people that you're meeting. You're early in the relationship with them. It's one of the first few times that you've met with them. Notice how often they say, well, I'm the type of person that does blank, or how much they look at you, how much it's important to them that you see them the way they see themselves. That's the self-verification theory. And it'll be interesting. Once you learn about it, you'll start to see it all around you. Does that kind of make sense? Because we do this, we like our self-concept tends not to change, and it can lead someone to be pretty low in self-awareness, right? Because if you are telling people how you are and you're seeking out confirming evidence that people see you that way, you might really be wrong in seeing yourself in a way that's very different from how you actually are. And it's going to be hard for you to change it because we are seeking out this self-verification all the time. Okay. All right, and the last thing, and then we're done for this chapter, is self-monitoring. And this can almost be thought of as a personality, not really a trait, but a characteristic of your personality. It tends to not change that much, although teenagers tend to, almost everyone during their teenage years is a high self-monitor. So self-monitoring is exactly what you think it is. It's how much you monitor the situation to know how you should act, how yourself should act. What part of yourself should you show in this particular situation? So you monitor yourself to match what the situation is calling for. Okay. High self-monitors are people that do this really well. They tend to be great salespeople. Don't you have a friend who just always knows the right thing to say? You can bring them to any event, something that's stuffy with lots of hoity-toity people. You can take them to something that's much more casual, much more diverse group of people. And you know that they'll always say the right thing to the right group of people. They know how to camouflage really well. They're a little bit, not camouflage, they can be a chameleon. They can be whatever the situation needs them to be. They adapt to this, they can adapt themselves to fit the situation that they're in very well. They're high self-monitors. And during our teenage years, almost all of us become high self-monitors during those years. We're really looking at the situation because we want to belong to these groups. We want to fit in. So we're changing aspects of ourselves so that we think we'll fit in better. There's also people who are low self-monitors. These are people true blue. I'm sure you have a friend like that too. They are who they are, wherever they are, that's who they are. And they're always the same. And you know exactly what they're going to be like. Does that kind of make sense? The example I always use that fits with me is my baby sister. I talk about how I'm the oldest of 6 kids. So she's 13 years younger than I am. And she is more fun than a barrel of monkeys. I mean, she is a blast. And she is a low self-monitor. She is who she is all the time. And she's a lot of fun. She always says things that are funny and kind and sweet, but always the life of the party. And she's a blast. And her husband is an officer, well, now he's retired, but retired officer, colonel. And, most of the officer wives are much more likely to be high self-monitors who adapt to the different situations, but not my sister. She is always this fun-loving, outgoing, sort of on the loud, giggling ball of fun. And she's like that, whether she's with a four-star general or people in her husband's group. It didn't matter. And she is a low self-monitor. Kate is always Kate wherever you take Kate. And my mom, who's probably one of the highest self-monitors I've ever met, she's always going to be what's appropriate in the right situation. She, almost gets upset with my sister Kate always being Kate. And she'll say, you can't bring your sister anyplace, meaning, in certain situations, Kate may not fit in as well. But you can see how most of us are on a continuum, high, medium, low, somewhere else on the continuum. And it's not good or bad. There's great things about being a high self-monitor. There's great things about being a low self-monitor. It's not good or bad. It just is. But self-monitoring is like one of the personality, I don't want to call it a trait, but it's not one of the big 5 traits anyway, but it's one of the conditions that we are, and you can see it as a continuum. And it's talked about in your textbook in this chapter. So, all right, we have covered chapter 3 on the self. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week.